You did not stumble here by accident. You did not find this message because an algorithm decided you needed something to watch tonight. Something far older than any platform, far more precise than any recommendation engine, pressed this moment into your path before you ever drew your first breath. The fact that you are here, right now, listening to these words is not a coincidence. It is a confirmation. And if something inside you already knows that, if something in your chest stirred the moment you heard those words, then you need to understand something about yourself that most people around you have never been able to see. You are not like the rest. That is not a compliment designed to make you feel good for a few minutes and then fade when the video ends. That is a statement of divine architecture. You were constructed differently. Your hunger is different. Your pain runs deeper than most people can understand. Your sensitivity picks up frequencies that others walk right past without blinking. The things that break your heart do not even register on the radar of the people sitting next to you. And for most of your life, that difference has felt like a burden. It has felt like a flaw. It has felt like evidence that something went wrong somewhere in the making of you. But I need you to hear this clearly. Nothing went wrong. Everything went exactly according to a design so precise, so intentional, so layered with purpose, that the very traits you have spent years apologizing for are the same traits that make the enemy of your destiny lose sleep at night. There are people in your life who looked at you and decided you were too much, too sensitive, too intense, too different, too slow or too fast or too quiet or too loud. There are people who placed a ceiling on your potential and then stood back waiting for you to confirm their assessment. There are rooms you walked out of where the conversation shifted the moment you left, where someone leaned over to someone else and said, "Watch, this one will not make it." And some of those people were not strangers. Some of them were people whose voices you trusted, people whose opinion you would have done anything to earn, people whose doubt you carried around like a stone in your chest for years, convincing yourself that maybe they were right, maybe the evidence was against you, maybe the dream in your heart was nothing more than a beautiful, embarrassing mistake. But let me tell you what was actually happening in those moments. While they were counting you out, heaven was counting you in. While they were writing your ending, God was still writing your beginning. While they were confident in your limitations, the one who designed you was already watching the version of you that exists on the other side of everything you have been through, and that version is something they are not prepared for. That version is something that will leave them standing with their mouths open, unable to explain what they are witnessing, unable to reconcile the person they dismissed with the one now standing in the fullness of everything that was always intended. You have carried more than most. You have endured seasons that would have collapsed people who looked far more capable than you felt. You have sat in silence when you wanted to scream. You have smiled in rooms where your heart was quietly breaking. You have kept going when every reasonable instinct told you to stop. And here is what I need you to understand. That endurance is not just personality. That staying power is not just stubbornness. That capacity to hold on when everything logical says let go is a mark. It is a sign pressed into the fabric of who you are by a hand that does not mark ordinary things. Chosen ones carry weight that would destroy unselected people, not because they are perfect, not because they never doubt, but because they were built with a resilience that only gets activated under pressure. And the pressure you have been under has been doing something to you that no one around you could see. They saw someone struggling. Heaven saw someone being prepared. They saw someone falling behind. Heaven saw someone being positioned. They saw someone who could not quite get it together. Heaven saw someone whose timing had not yet arrived, and when it does, nothing in the natural realm will be able to hold it back. There are people who are going to be absolutely terrified of who you are becoming, not because you will harm them, not because you will seek revenge or stand over anyone in pride, but because the sight of someone who was counted out rising to the fullness of their calling is one of the most disorienting things a human being can witness. It challenges every assumption. It dismantles every comfortable conclusion. It forces people to confront the reality that they were wrong, not just about you, but about what is possible, about what God is willing to do, about how far a life can travel when it is truly in the right hands. And that terror, that wide-eyed, speechless, cannot explain it terror in the eyes of the ones who underestimated you. That is not your revenge. That is your confirmation. Right now, if you feel that stirring in your spirit, if something in you is rising up as you hear these words, if there is a part of you that recognizes this message as something you needed to hear, I want you to do one thing. Type the number 333 in the comments right now. Not because it is a ritual, not because the number itself holds power, but because it is an act of agreement. It is you saying, yes, I receive this, yes, I believe it, yes, I am here and I am ready. Let 333 be your declaration in this moment. Because what is coming for you is not small. What has been held in reserve for this season of your life is not something that can be summarized in a sentence. The weight of the waiting, the length of the silent seasons, the depth of the wounds, all of it has been calibrating something in you. All of it has been doing a work that could not have been done any faster, could not have been done any cheaper, could not have been accomplished without every single thing you walked through. And the reason it matters so much that you are here tonight, listening to this specific message, is because you are standing closer to the edge of your appointed moment than you have ever stood before. The people who underestimated you did not just misjudge your ability. They misjudged your source. They looked at the container and forgot to account for what was living inside it. They measured you by what was visible and missed entirely what was being formed in the unseen places. And now, the unseen is about to become undeniable. Now, the thing that was growing in the dark is about to break through the surface in a way that no one who watched you struggle will be able to explain away. You are not at the beginning of a story that might work out. You are deep into a story that was already written to end in vindication, restoration, and a kind of overflow that makes every year of waiting look like an investment with the most extraordinary return anyone has ever witnessed. Stay with me, because this is only where it begins. You did not arrive at this moment carrying an ordinary story. The road that brought you here, the seasons of confusion, the years of feeling invisible, the moments where you stood in front of a mirror and genuinely could not reconcile the person looking back at you with the person you sensed you were supposed to be. All of that has a pattern running through it that is far more intentional than it appears. And to help you see that pattern clearly, I need to take you to a moment recorded in the book of Judges, to a man sitting at the bottom of a winepress, thrashing wheat in secret, hiding from his enemies, doing the smallest possible version of his work in the most concealed possible location, because fear had convinced him that small and hidden was the only safe way to exist. His name was Gideon, and the first thing heaven ever said to him was the last thing he expected to hear. An angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Not "the Lord sees your potential," not "the Lord knows you have been through a lot." Mighty warrior, a title so far removed from Gideon's current reality that his response was essentially, "Are you sure you have the right person?" Because Gideon was not standing on a battlefield. He was not leading an army. He was not training in secret for a moment of greatness he could feel approaching. He was hiding. He was afraid. He was operating in survival mode in a season where his people had been so thoroughly oppressed by their enemies that they had retreated into caves and dens and mountain strongholds just to stay alive. And yet, heaven looked at this hiding, frightened, self-doubting man and addressed him not by what he was doing, but by what he carried, not by his circumstances, but by his design. Not by the version of himself that fear had produced, but by the version that divine purpose had always intended. That is the first thing you need to understand about how God sees you right now. He is not looking at the version of you that exhaustion built. He is not evaluating you based on the season you are coming out of, the mistakes that still replay in your memory at 2 in the morning, or the gap between where you are and where you thought you would be by now. When heaven looks in your direction, it addresses what was, placed inside you before the world ever got its hands on you, before disappointment had a chance to narrate your identity, before the voices of people who did not understand your assignment were given enough airtime to make you question whether the assignment was real. Heaven looks at you and calls you by the name that was written before you were born, and that name has nothing to do with your worst season and everything to do with your original design. Gideon pushed back. He said, "Pardon me, my lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." This is one of the most honest moments in all of Scripture, and it is honest in a way that should feel deeply familiar to you. Because you have had versions of that conversation, maybe not out loud, maybe not directed at an angel sitting under a tree, but in the quiet of your own mind, in the private negotiations you have had with your own potential. You have looked at the size of what you sense you are supposed to do, and then looked at the resources available to you and concluded that the math does not work. You have counted yourself out using the same categories Gideon used: background, family position, perceived weakness, the clan you came from, the starting point you were given, the apparent disadvantage of your origins, and the logic felt sound. The evidence seemed to support the conclusion. The reasonable, responsible, intellectually honest assessment appeared to confirm that you were not the one for this. But God's response to Gideon's objection was not a rebuttal of his reasoning. It was not a detailed argument dismantling each point of his self-assessment. God simply said, "I will be with you." That was the entire answer. Not "you are stronger than you think." Not "here is a list of your overlooked qualities." Not "let me show you the hidden resources you have been ignoring." Just "I will be with you." Because the chosen one's qualification was never rooted in their own inventory. It was always rooted in whose presence accompanied them into the room, and that presence changes the calculation entirely. It changes what is possible. It changes what obstacles are able to withstand. It changes what the outcome of the story is allowed to be. The people in your life who underestimated you were making the same mistake that Gideon's enemies would eventually make. They were calculating based on what they could see, and what they could see was incomplete. They saw the winepress. They did not see the angel. They saw the hiding. They did not see the calling. They saw the weakness of your clan, the modesty of your beginning, the smallness of your current expression, and they drew conclusions that felt logical, but were missing the single most important variable in the entire equation. They forgot to account for what was walking with you. They forgot to factor in the presence that had been assigned to your life before you ever understood what that meant, and that omission made their entire assessment worthless. Not partially wrong, not slightly miscalibrated, but worthless, because a calculation that leaves out the most significant factor is not an approximation of the truth. It is a different answer entirely. Judges chapter 6, verse 16, "The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Gideon went on to defeat an army of 135,000 soldiers with 300 men, no conventional weapons, no military advantage, no logical explanation for how the outcome unfolded the way it did. The victory was so complete and so disproportionate to the visible resources involved that the only honest conclusion anyone could draw was that something beyond natural explanation had been present in the battle. And the people who had oppressed Gideon's people, who had driven them into caves, who had stolen their harvests and broken their strength for 7 long years, those people did not just lose. They were rooted by someone they never saw coming, by someone whose name was not on their list of threats, by someone who had been hiding in a winepress when the whole story began. That is the trajectory your story is on. The ones who dismissed you, who passed over you, who decided without sufficient information that you were not worth their investment of belief. They have made the same error that the Midianites made about Gideon. They assessed the external and missed the internal. They measured the beginning and drew conclusions about the ending. They watched you hide and assumed that hiding was your permanent posture, not understanding that the hiding was a season, not a sentence, that the concealment was temporary, not terminal, that the winepress was a preparation room, not a permanent address. And what is about to emerge from the preparation you have been in is going to be as disproportionate and as inexplicable as 300 men routing an army of 135,000, because the same God who was with Gideon in that winepress has been with you in every low place you have occupied. And he does not accompany chosen ones into preparation seasons and then leave them there. The thing that has been growing in you during the years that looked like nothing is about to become something that cannot be contained, cannot be explained, and cannot be denied. And the people who underestimated you are about to run out of alternative explanations for what they are witnessing. They are going to have to stand in the presence of your elevation and reckon with the fact that they were wrong, not because you are going to make them, not because you are going to seek that moment, but because the fruit of a life that has been genuinely prepared by God is self-evidencing. It does not need a press release. It does not need a defense. It simply needs to be seen, and it is almost time for it to be seen. There is something that happens in the spirit of a chosen one that has no adequate word in the natural language. It is the moment when the weight of being misread becomes so familiar that you stop expecting to be understood, when the gap between who you actually are and who others have decided you are becomes so wide that you quietly stop trying to bridge it, when the accumulated evidence of being overlooked and undervalued settles into a kind of low background noise that you learn to function around without ever fully healing from. You know that feeling. You have lived inside it for longer than you should have had to. And I want to speak directly into that place tonight, because what happened to you in those seasons was not a reflection of your value. It was a reflection of the limited vision of people who were never assigned to recognize you in the first place. Gideon knew what it felt like to carry a calling in a context that gave it no room to breathe. He knew what it felt like to watch the people around him suffer, to feel something rising in his chest that said this does not have to be the end of the story, and then to look at his own hands and his own resources and his own position and feel the rising thing collapse back down under the weight of what appeared to be an impossible distance between the problem and any solution he could offer. He knew what it felt like to be from the wrong family in the wrong tribe with the wrong resume at what appeared to be the wrong time. And he knew, perhaps most painfully, what it felt like to have spent years watching the people who should have been his community surrender to a narrative of defeat so completely that they had stopped imagining a different outcome was even available to them. Because one of the cruelest things that prolonged oppression does is not just to the body or the circumstances. It does something to the imagination. It narrows the field of what a person believes is possible until the only future they can conceive of is a slightly more manageable version of the suffering they are already in. And when Gideon rose to the call that God placed on his life, he did not just have to overcome his own doubt. He had to carry his calling in an environment where the people around him had largely stopped believing that deliverance was real, had stopped expecting that someone from among them could be the instrument of a change so total and so decisive that it would rewrite the story of an entire generation. That is an almost unbearable weight to carry, the weight of a vision that the people closest to you cannot yet see, the weight of a knowing that has no external confirmation, the weight of moving towards something that looks, from every available angle, like an impossibility dressed up as a calling. And yet Gideon moved, not perfectly, not without fear, not without moments of asking God for additional confirmation, for the fleece to be wet and then dry, for one more sign that this was real and not a desperate misinterpretation of his own longing for things to be different. He moved with trembling. He moved with questions still unanswered. He moved with the weight of his own inadequacy fully present in his chest, and the voice of his own limitation still audible in his mind. And that movement, that imperfect, fear-accompanied, doubt-threaded forward motion, was exactly what God used to bring down one of the most formidable military forces his people had ever faced. Because God has never required perfection as the entry point for purpose. He has only ever required availability, the willingness to say yes to the next step even when the full staircase is not visible, the willingness to move toward the thing you were made for even when moving feels like the least reasonable option in the room. You have been that person more times than you have given yourself credit for. You have said yes when no would have been easier. You have gotten back up when staying down would have required far less of you. You have kept the dream alive in seasons where killing it would have felt like mercy, and every single one of those choices was a form of movement, a form of the same trembling forward motion that Gideon made, and heaven has been recording every step of it. Nothing has been lost. Nothing has been wasted. Not the years that felt like they were going nowhere, not the attempts that did not produce the results you were hoping for, not the moments of private courage that no one around you witnessed or acknowledged. All of it has been accumulating into something, building toward a threshold that you are closer to crossing than anything in your current circumstances would suggest. The people who judged you based on what they could observe were not wrong to use their eyes. They were wrong to trust only their eyes. Because the most significant things happening in the life of a chosen one are almost always invisible to casual observation. The formation that takes place in the hidden seasons, the character that gets refined in the furnace of prolonged waiting, the depth of trust that gets built in, the years of silence when heaven seems to have gone quiet, and the only thing sustaining forward motion is a thread of faith so thin it should not logically be enough, but somehow always is. None of that shows up on the surface in a way that outside observers can measure or assess. They see the surface. God sees the structure, and the structure He has been building in you has been designed to hold the weight of everything that is about to be placed upon your life. Judges chapter 7, verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me." Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. God looked at Gideon's army and said it was too large, not too small, too large, because the victory that was coming needed to be so disproportionate, so obviously beyond natural explanation, that no one involved would be tempted to attribute it to human strategy or human strength. God reduced Gideon's army from 32,000 men to 300, not because 300 was a more tactically sound number, but because 300 made the outcome undeniable. 300 made it impossible to look at what happened and find a natural explanation sufficient to account for it. 300 made the glory land where it belonged, on the one whose presence had been the actual deciding factor from the very beginning. And I want you to hear this. The stripping away you have experienced, the reduction of your resources, the narrowing of your options, the seasons where things you were counting on fell away and you were left with less than you started with, that was not punishment. That was the same divine mathematics at work in your situation that reduced Gideon's army to 300. Because God is not interested in a version of your story where the outcome can be explained by your connections, your background, your talent, or your strategy alone. He is building a version of your story where the only honest explanation for how it ends is that something beyond natural accounting was present and active in your life. He is setting up a testimony so clear, so complete, so undeniable, that the people who watched you lose will be standing in the presence of your victory without a single alternative explanation to reach for. The ones who underestimated you chose the wrong person to write off. Not because you are impressive by the world's standard of impressive, but because the God who called you does not measure by that standard, has never measured by that standard, and has a long and well-documented history of choosing the ones that every reasonable external assessment would have passed over, then doing through them something so far beyond what their visible resources could account for that even the people who knew them best are left shaking their heads in stunned, reluctant, undeniable wonder. That is the category you belong to. That is the company you are in. And what is coming for you belongs in the same sentence as what came for Gideon, not because your story is a copy of his, but because the God writing both stories is the same, and he has not changed his methods, his preferences, or his love for choosing the ones the world forgot to watch. Everything you have just received in this message, every word that has landed in the deep place, every recognition that stirred something in you that you had almost stopped listening to, that is not an accident of timing. That is the continuation of the same intentional design that has been threading through your entire life, and it leads somewhere specific. It leads to a moment of activation, not just spiritual. Activation, not just emotional awakening, but the kind of activation that reaches into the very physical structure of the mind that God gave you and unlocks what was always there, waiting for the right frequency to call it forward. Because here is something that science and scripture are finally beginning to say in the same breath. Chosen ones carry a specific frequency. Researchers who study the brain at the highest levels call it gamma, and what they have discovered about that frequency is something that should make every single person who has ever felt different, who has ever sensed that their mind operates on a wavelength others cannot quite access, stop and pay very close attention. For more than 30 years, a neuroscientist named Dr. James Rivers, trained at some of the most rigorous research institutions in the world, and connected to studies conducted in partnership with NASA, has been investigating something that the mainstream conversation about human potential has almost entirely overlooked. He has been studying the relationship between specific brainwave frequencies and the kind of breakthrough thinking, creative clarity, and accelerated learning that seems to appear in certain people almost effortlessly, while remaining completely out of reach for others regardless of how hard they try. And what he found, after decades of research and thousands of hours of data, is both simpler and more profound than most people are prepared to hear. The human brain operates across a spectrum of frequencies. You have delta waves which dominate deep sleep. You have alpha waves which appear in relaxed wakefulness. You have beta waves which characterize ordinary focused thinking. And then you have two frequencies that sit at the edges of what most adult brains access with any regularity. The first is theta, ranging from 4 to 8 Hz, the frequency associated with deep creativity, accelerated learning, intuitive knowing, and the kind of meditative depth that most people spend years of practice trying to reach. The second is gamma, sitting above 30 Hz, the frequency that researchers have found present in the brains of people during moments of sudden insight, breakthrough clarity, peak performance, and what neuroscientists call flow states, the moments when everything aligns and the mind operates at a level that feels almost superhuman. Here is what Dr. Rivers discovered that changes everything. Children access theta and gamma waves naturally and constantly, but somewhere in the process of growing up, of absorbing stress and pressure, and the accumulated weight of living in a world that is loud and demanding and relentless, the brain gradually drifts away from those frequencies. The pathways do not disappear. They simply go quiet. And the result is that most adults are walking around with an extraordinary capacity sitting dormant in their own minds, not because it was taken from them, but because no one ever showed them how to return to it. The chosen ones, the ones who have always felt different, who have always sensed a depth in their own thinking that did not match the surface of their circumstances, have often been brushing against these frequencies without knowing what to call them. Those moments of sudden clarity that arrive without warning, those seasons of creative flow where ideas come faster than you can capture them, those instants of knowing something before you have any rational basis for knowing it. That is not mysticism disconnected from science. That is your brain accessing the frequencies it was designed to access. And what Dr. Rivers built, after 30 years of research, is a way to make that access consistent, reliable, and available to anyone who chooses it. The tool is called the Genius Wave. It is a 7-minute audio program built on the science of brainwave entrainment, the documented phenomenon by which the brain synchronizes its own electrical activity to external frequencies introduced through sound. Using precisely calibrated binaural beats and isochronic tones, the Genius Wave guides your brain gently and efficiently into the theta and gamma states that unlock memory, creativity, focus, and cognitive performance at levels most people have never experienced in their adult lives. 7 minutes. That is the entire time investment, not an hour of meditation practice, not years of discipline building, not a complicated protocol requiring special equipment or specialized knowledge. 7 minutes of listening, and your brain begins doing what it was always designed to do, operating at the frequency of the person you were always meant to be. And this connects directly to something practical that I want you to carry with you into the days ahead, because in a moment, we are going to talk about how to build this into the rhythm of your life in a way that compounds over time and produces results that will surprise even you. But first, I want to tell you about some of the people who have already walked this path, because their stories are not abstract testimonials. They are mirrors, and one of them is going to reflect something you recognize. A woman named Sandra, a 43-year-old primary school teacher who had spent 18 months feeling like her mind was moving through fog, struggling to stay present in her own classroom, going home exhausted in a way that sleep did not fix, tried the Genius Wave after hearing about it from a colleague. She committed to 7 minutes every morning for 3 weeks. By the end of the first week, she told the person who shared it with her that she had written more lesson plans in 4 days than she had produced in the previous month, that her thinking felt sharper and faster, and that for the first time in over a year she had sat down to read a book and actually finished it in one sitting because her focus held. By the end of 3 weeks, her students had noticed something different about her energy in the classroom. She had not told anyone what she was doing. The results spoke before she said a word. There is also the story of a man named David, a 38-year-old who had been running a small business for 6 years, always feeling like he was one good idea away from the breakthrough he needed, but never quite able to access the clarity that would unlock it. Within 2 weeks of using the Genius Wave consistently, he told his accountability partner that he had solved an operational problem in his business that had been sitting unresolved for almost 2 years, not through any new information, but through a shift in how his mind was processing what he already knew. The solution had been available to him the entire time. His brain simply had not been operating at the frequency required to see it. Now, I know what some of you are thinking right now, and I want to acknowledge it directly before we go any further, because your hesitation is valid and it deserves to be respected rather than talked past. $39 is not nothing. In a season where resources are tight, where every decision about where money goes carries real weight, where you have possibly been burned before by promises that sounded transformational and delivered disappointment, the instinct to pause and question is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the same discernment that has kept you from making costly mistakes in other areas of your life, and I am not going to ask you to override it. I am going to ask you to sit it alongside something else, which is the cost of continuing exactly as you are. The cost of another year of operating below the frequency you were designed for. The cost of the ideas that do not surface, the clarity that does not arrive, the creativity that stays just out of reach because the access point was never opened. That cost does not show up as a number on a receipt, but it is real, and over time it compounds in ways that are far more expensive than $39. The Genius Wave is normally priced at $49, and at that price it is already one of the most accessible investments in cognitive performance available anywhere. But through the link in the pinned comment below this video, you can access it today for just $39, a full $10 off the standard price, available for a limited time and a limited number of purchases at this rate. Every purchase comes with a 90-day money-back guarantee, which means you have 3 full months to use it, to experience what it does in your own mind and your own life. And if at the end of that time you are not satisfied, you receive every dollar back without question or complication. There is no risk in the direction of trying. The only risk is in the direction of not trying, and that risk is one you have already been carrying longer than you needed to. One more thing before we move forward, and this matters more than it might seem. There are imitation products circulating online that use similar language and similar claims, but are not the Genius Wave and do not contain the specific calibration that Dr. Rivers developed through 30 years of research. Please purchase only through the official link in the pinned comment and the video description. That is the only source where you are guaranteed to receive the authentic program, and it is the only purchase that comes with the full 90-day guarantee. The discounted price of $39 is not permanent. It is available for a limited window and a limited number of purchases, and when that window closes, it closes. If something in you is responding to this, if something in you recognizes that this is for you, do not let the moment pass. The link is there. The door is open. And what is on the other side of 7 minutes a day is something worth walking through. What you just received is not separate from the spiritual journey you are on. It is an extension of it, another thread in the same tapestry that has been unfolding across every word of this message, because God has never been confined to one category of provision. He speaks through Scripture, and He speaks through science. He moves through prayer, and He moves through the precise architecture of the mind He designed and placed inside your skull before you took your first breath. The frequency that researchers spent decades trying to isolate and understand is the same frequency that was woven into you at creation. And the fact that you are now aware of both the spiritual dimension and the practical dimension of what you carry is not a coincidence. It is a convergence. And convergences of this kind do not happen by accident in the life of a chosen one. Now come back with me to Gideon, because his story has not finished speaking yet. And what happens next in his journey is the part that most people who know the broad outline of his life have never sat with long enough to fully absorb. After God called him, after the confirmation of the fleece, after the army was reduced to 300 men, and the human logic supporting any reasonable expectation of victory had been systematically removed, Gideon stood at the edge of the Midianite camp in the middle of the night holding a torch inside a clay jar and a trumpet in his other hand. That image deserves more than a passing glance. A torch inside a clay jar, light contained within a fragile, ordinary vessel, invisible to everyone outside until the moment of breaking, until the moment the jar was smashed and the flame that had been burning unseen inside it was suddenly, dramatically, undeniably present in the darkness for every surrounding eye to see. That is you. That has been you through every season that felt like concealment, through every chapter that felt like delay, through every year that the people around you could not see what was happening because what was happening was on the inside, contained within a vessel that looked ordinary from the outside, that gave no obvious indication of the fire being carried within it. You have been a torch inside a clay jar, and the jarring, the breaking open, The moment of exposure that felt like loss but was actually release. That has been the process through which the light you carry has been preparing to show itself to a world that has no idea what is about to illuminate the darkness around it. Gideon's men did not fight with conventional weapons. They fought with light and with sound. They smashed their jars, held up their torches, and blew their trumpets, and the enemy camp erupted into confusion so complete that the Midianite soldiers began turning their swords on each other. The very army that had oppressed God's people for 7 years, that had driven them into hiding, that had consumed their harvests, and broken their strength, and made them believe that this was simply how life was going to be. That army destroyed itself in the presence of 300 flames held up in the darkness. Not because of the military genius of 300 men. Because of the disorienting, destabilizing, irresistible power of light showing up in a place that had been given over to darkness, carried by people who had been prepared in hiddenness for a moment of sudden, total, overwhelming revelation. The book of Judges chapter 7 verse 22 says, "When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords." Every force that has been working against you, every structure of opposition that has been consuming what belongs to you, every plan that was designed to keep you small and silent and contained, is subject to the same principle that undid the Midianite army. It does not require you to match it in size or strength or strategy. It requires you to show up in the fullness of the light you carry and let the frequency of a life surrendered to divine purpose do what human effort alone never could. The enemy of your destiny is not undone by your aggression. It is undone by your emergence. It is undone by the moment when the jar finally breaks and what has been burning inside you all along is no longer hidden from the world around you. And here is what that emergence looks like in practical terms, because chosen ones sometimes need the abstract made concrete, need the prophetic brought down to the level of the daily, need to understand not just what is coming but how to position themselves for it. The emergence does not always arrive as a single dramatic moment, though sometimes it does. More often it arrives as a series of threshold crossings, moments where you choose the thing that is aligned with your calling over the thing that is comfortable, where you say yes to an opportunity that your old self would have been too afraid to accept, where you allow the version of you that God has been forming in the hidden season to step forward into a visible space and trust that the preparation was sufficient. Each of those threshold crossings is a jar being smashed. Each one releases more of the light. Each one makes the darkness around you a little more uncomfortable with your presence, and discomfort in the enemy's camp is always a sign that something is moving in the right direction. You have been in a long preparation, longer possibly than you think was necessary, longer certainly than felt comfortable or fair or proportionate to what you were waiting for. But the length of a chosen one's preparation is always calibrated to the weight of what they are being prepared to carry, and the weight of what is coming for you required a depth of formation that a shorter season could not have produced. Gideon could not have led 300 men into the camp of 135,000 soldiers on the second day of his calling. The man who answered heaven's summons from inside the winepress, trembling and full of objections, was not yet the man capable of standing in the darkness holding a torch and a trumpet with 300 others, and trusting that light was enough. The distance between those two versions of Gideon was not wasted time. It was the entire point. And the distance between the version of you who first began to sense that something significant was on your life and the version of you that is emerging right now has been the same kind of necessary, irreplaceable, cannot be shortcut formation. The people who dismissed you in the early seasons were not entirely wrong about what they observed. They were wrong about what it meant. They saw the winepress and concluded it was your address. They saw the hiding and concluded it was your nature. They saw the smallness of your beginnings and decided it was the measure of your ceiling. But what they were actually observing was the clay jar, and the clay jar was never the story. The fire inside it was always the story, and the fire inside you has been burning longer and burning hotter than anyone standing outside your life has been able to detect. That is about to change. The season of concealment is giving way to a season of emergence, and the emergence of a chosen one who has been genuinely prepared in the hidden place is one of the most breathtaking things the natural world ever gets to witness. So as these words settle into you, I want you to resist the temptation to minimize what you are feeling right now. Do not talk yourself back down to the comfortable level of low expectation that has felt like safety for so long. Do not reach for the familiar narrative that says this sounds beautiful but probably does not apply to me specifically. It does apply to you specifically. The specificity of divine calling means that this message in this moment is not a general broadcast that happens to be reaching your ears. It is a precise transmission aimed at the exact place in you that most needs to receive it, delivered at the exact moment in your story when you are capable of doing something with it that you were not capable of doing before. The timing is not accidental. The readiness is not accidental. The fact that something in you has been tracking with every word of this message and saying, yes, yes, this is real, this is mine, this is the thing I have been waiting to hear. That is not wishful thinking. That is recognition. And recognition of this kind is itself a form of confirmation that the calling is real, that the preparation was real, and that what comes next is going to be more real than anything you have dared to believe for a very long time. There is a fire in you that was never meant to burn for you alone. Everything that has been deposited into your life through the seasons of preparation, through the weight of the waiting, through the breaking open that felt like loss but was actually release, all of it was never designed to terminate at the boundary of your own experience. Chosen ones are not chosen for private elevation. They are chosen for public impact. They are chosen to carry something that changes the atmosphere of every room they enter, that shifts the temperature of every conversation they participate in, that leaves people different from how it found them, not because of anything manufactured or performed, but because of what is genuinely present in a life that has been through the fire and come out carrying light instead of ash. Gideon did not break his jar and hold up his torch for himself. He did it in the company of 300 others, and the light that each of them carried combined with the light of every other flame to produce an illumination that the darkness of an entire enemy camp could not withstand. That is what happens when chosen ones refuse to keep their light contained, when they stop apologizing for the fire they carry, when they step into the fullness of their calling and allow what God placed in them to be visible, to be present, to be offered to a world that is desperately short of the kind of light that only genuine preparation produces. And right now, in this moment, you have an opportunity to do exactly that, to extend the reach of what you have received in this message to someone else who needs it as badly as you needed it when you first pressed play. If this message has done something in you, if it has touched a place that needed to be touched, if it has spoken to a part of your story that you had quietly given up on, then the most natural response in the world is to make sure it reaches someone else who is sitting where you were sitting when you began listening. Share this video. It takes seconds and it costs nothing, and the person on the other end of that share might be someone who has been in their own winepress for longer than they can sustain, someone who has been carrying a calling they have almost stopped believing in, someone who needed to hear tonight that the God who called Gideon from his hiding place is still in the business of calling people out of concealment and into the fullness of everything they were designed to be. You do not need to know who that person is before you share. You simply need to trust that it will find the one it was meant to find, because that is how this works. That is how the light spreads, one act of generosity at a time. One chosen one refusing to keep the fire to themselves and passing it forward into the darkness where someone else is waiting. If this channel has been a place where you have found something real, something that goes beyond entertainment or information and actually reaches the place in you where the most important things live, then like this video and subscribe if you have not already done so. Not as a transaction, not as a favor to an algorithm, but as an act of alignment, as a way of saying, yes, I want to stay connected to this. I want this frequency in my life on a regular basis. I want to be part of a community of people who are choosing to take their calling seriously and refusing to let the weight of what they have been through become the ceiling of what they are allowed to become. This channel exists because there are people in the world who need to hear that they were chosen before they were challenged, that they were designed before they were disappointed, that the God who started something in them has not changed his mind about finishing it, and every subscriber, every share, every like is another person joining that company of the called and refusing to sit quietly in the winepress any longer. There is also something I want to mention gently, because it comes from a place of genuine gratitude rather than obligation. This work, the hours of prayer and preparation and writing and recording that go into each message, is sustained by the generosity of people who have found something valuable here and want to see it continue. If you feel led to support this channel financially, there is a donate link in the video description and in the pinned comment below. Every contribution, regardless of size, goes directly into the continuation of this work, into making sure that the next person who needs to hear that they are chosen and called and not forgotten by heaven has a place to come and receive that word. You are never required to give, but if something in you wants to, that desire is itself a form of the same generosity that Gideon's 300 demonstrated when they broke their jars and held up their flames in the darkness, the willingness to offer what you have in service of a light that is bigger than any one of us. Now come back to the thread that has been running through every section of this message, because it is still unfolding, and there is more that needs to be said about the season you are stepping into. Because the fire you carry is not a feeling that comes and goes with the emotional weather of any given day. It is a permanent feature of who you are, a fixture of your design that does not require ideal circumstances to remain lit. That does not depend on external validation to keep burning. That does not go out when the people around you fail to acknowledge it, or when the season you are in gives no visible indication that it is producing anything of value. The fire of a chosen one is self-sustaining in a way that has nothing to do with the chosen one's own effort and everything to do with the source that ignited it in the first place. And that source has not grown tired of you. That is the word I want to leave resting in you as this section closes and the message continues to unfold. God has not grown tired of your process. He has not looked at the length of your preparation and concluded that it is taking too long. He has not reviewed the detours and the setbacks and the seasons of apparent stagnation and decided that the investment is no longer worth making. He is not the kind of father who starts a work and loses interest before it is finished, who calls someone into a purpose and then gets distracted before the purpose is fulfilled, who plants a fire and then forgets to tend it. Every day that you have continued to breathe, every morning that you have opened your eyes into another chapter of a story that has not yet shown you its ending, is evidence that the one who started this has not stopped. And a God who has not stopped is a God who is still moving, still building, still preparing the ground for a moment of breakthrough that is going to make every year of waiting look like the most reasonable investment that was ever made in your story. The people who underestimated you have no idea what they set in motion by dismissing you. They have no idea that every closed door pushed you deeper into the preparation that was required for the open door that is coming. They have no idea that every season of being overlooked was another layer of formation being added to a foundation that is now strong enough to hold the weight of what God is about to place upon it. They looked at your struggle and saw your ceiling. Heaven looked at your struggle and saw your training ground. And training grounds produce something that comfort never could. They produce the kind of person who does not collapse under the weight of greatness because they have already learned, through years of carrying more than seemed survivable, that they are stronger than the weight, that they are more resilient than the pressure, that they are more durable than anything that has ever tried to break them. That is the person you are. That is the person this message has been speaking to from the very first word. And as we continue moving forward together into the remaining sections of what God has prepared for this moment, I want you to carry that knowledge not as a distant hope, but as a present reality. Not as something you are still working toward, but as something that is already true about you, already written into the fabric of your identity, already sealed by a hand that does not unseal what it has chosen. You are the fire inside the jar, and the jar is breaking open. There is a particular kind of silence that chosen ones know better than almost any other experience. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence that settles in after you have prayed and heard nothing back, after you have waited and seen no movement, after you have held on to a promise so long that the holding itself has become the only evidence you have that the promise was ever real. It is the silence that makes you wonder, in the most private and unguarded moments of your interior life, whether heaven has simply moved on, whether the calling you felt so clearly in an earlier season was a product of your own longing rather than a genuine transmission from a source outside yourself, whether the dream that has survived this long has survived not because it is real, but because you have simply not yet found the courage to let it go. That silence is one of the most difficult things a chosen one ever has to navigate, and it is the thing that separates the ones who step into the fullness of their calling from the ones who turn back just before the breakthrough arrives. Gideon knew a version of that silence. After the angel's visitation, after the confirmation of the fleece, after the army was reduced and the instructions were given, there was a moment before the torches were lit and the trumpets were raised when Gideon stood in the darkness outside the Midianite camp with 300 men behind him and nothing visible ahead of him except the overwhelming reality of what he was about to do and the complete absence of any natural guarantee that it would work. The silence in that moment was not the silence of divine absence. It was the silence of divine trust, the silence that says, I have told you what to do and I am waiting to see whether you believe me enough to do it. And everything that followed, the smashing of the jars, the lifting of the torches, the sounding of the trumpets, the confusion and the routing and the complete dismantling of a force that had seemed immovable, all of it was on the other side of that silent, dark, trust-requiring moment. The silence you have been living in is not evidence that God has forgotten your address. It is evidence that you are in the moment before the torches are lifted, the moment that requires more of you than any other moment in the journey, because it requires you to act on what you were told in the light while you are standing in the dark. And the darkness of a chosen one's silent season is not the darkness of abandonment. It is the darkness of a night that is about to be split open by a fire that has been burning in secret long enough to be ready for the moment of its public revealing. You are not forgotten. You are not passed over. You are not the exception to a pattern of divine faithfulness that is held for every other person whose story you have read and drawn encouragement from. You are in the middle of the same pattern, in the same silent, dark, trust-requiring moment that every chosen one has had to navigate on the way from the calling to the fulfillment. And the way through it is the same way Gideon found his way through it. One step, one act of obedience, one jar smashed in the darkness at a time. The silence of heaven in a chosen one's waiting season is one of the most misread experiences in the entire spiritual journey. The natural human interpretation of silence is absence. If someone does not respond, the conclusion is that they are not there, or not listening, or not interested. And that interpretive framework, which works reasonably well in the context of human relationships, is almost entirely wrong when applied to the way God moves in the life of someone he has called. Because divine silence is almost never the silence of inattention. It is almost always the silence of a craftsman so focused on the work being done that commentary would be a distraction from it. The silence of a builder so committed to the integrity of the foundation being laid that the only thing that matters in this moment is that the work is being done correctly, not that the person the building is being constructed for has been reassured that progress is being made. The silence is the work. The absence of visible movement is often the season of the most significant invisible movement. And what feels like nothing happening is frequently the season when the most critical things are being established in places too deep for surface observation to detect. Psalm chapter 27, verse 14 says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." That word wait in the original language does not carry the passive resignation that the English word sometimes implies. It carries the meaning of a deliberate, active, expectant positioning, the posture of someone who is not simply sitting still, because there is nothing else to do, but who is standing at attention, fully present, fully alert, fully oriented toward the direction from which the response is coming, certain enough of its arrival to have already prepared themselves to move the moment it does. That is the posture that the silent seasons of a chosen one's journey are designed to develop, that quality of alert, expectant, unshakable orientation toward a promise that has not yet visibly materialized, but is already being treated as certain by the one who made it. And that quality, once formed, once genuinely embedded in the character of a person, is one of the most powerful spiritual assets they will ever carry into the seasons of visible fruitfulness that follow. Because the person who learned to trust in the silence is not rattled by opposition in the season of breakthrough. The person who held on when holding on made no logical sense is not shaken when the enemy makes one final attempt to destabilize what God is building. The person who developed the posture of waiting in the Gideon sense, standing at attention, fully present, fully expectant, treating the promise as settled even before the fulfillment is visible, that person walks into the open door with a steadiness and a confidence that is not arrogance and is not performance. It is simply the natural expression of a character that has been forged in the silence and found to be genuine. The ones who underestimated you did not understand what the silence was producing in you. They saw the quiet and interpreted it as stagnation. They saw the waiting and read it as inability. They saw the years of apparent stillness and concluded that you had simply reached your level and settled into it. But what was actually happening in those silent years was a formation so deep and so thorough that it could not have been accomplished in the noise and the visibility and the momentum of a season of obvious outward progress. The roots were going down. The foundation was being poured. The character was being stress-tested at levels that would have been unbearable in public, but were survivable in the private, hidden, silent place where only you and God knew what was actually being built. And now the building is ready to rise. Above the surface, ready to become visible, ready to show the watching world that what looked like nothing was actually the most productive season of construction that your life has ever contained. There is a restoration coming that is going to be so complete and so disproportionate to the loss you experienced that the people who watched you go through the silent years are going to struggle to reconcile the two chapters of your story. They are going to look at where you are and look back at where you were, and find that the distance between those 2 points does not compute by any natural measure of how far a person can travel in the time that has elapsed. And that incomputability, that inability to explain the distance by any available natural metric, is going to be one of the most powerful testimonies your life ever produces. Not because you set out to produce a testimony, but because a life that has been genuinely accompanied through the silence by the God who called it cannot arrive at its appointed moment without carrying the unmistakable fingerprints of a journey that no human strategy alone could have navigated. The silence was not your sentence, it was your seminary, and you are about to graduate into a season that makes every quiet year look like the most essential investment that was ever made in the story of who you are becoming. There is a moment in every chosen one's story when the atmosphere around them begins to shift in a way they did not initiate and cannot fully explain. It is not something they announced. It is not something they campaigned for or strategically engineered through the careful management of their public image or the deliberate cultivation of influential relationships. It simply begins to happen, quietly at first then, with increasing momentum, then with a force so undeniable that even the people who most firmly committed to the narrative of your limitation find themselves standing in the presence of something they did not see coming and cannot adequately account for. People who never returned your calls begin to reach out. Doors that were closed so long you stopped knocking begin to open from the inside. Opportunities that would have required years of networking and positioning begin to arrive through channels you never worked and connections you never cultivated. And the ones who wrote you off, the ones who placed a ceiling on your potential and then stood back waiting for you to confirm their assessment, those people begin to feel something in the presence of your rising that they did not expect to feel. They begin to feel afraid. That fear is not imaginary. It is not a projection of your wounded ego onto people who simply moved on with their lives. It is a real, documented, spiritually significant response to the emergence of someone who was chosen and prepared, and is now stepping into the visible expression of what was formed in the hidden place. And it is worth understanding why it happens, because understanding it will keep you from misinterpreting it when you encounter it, will keep you from either shrinking back in response to it or allowing it to produce in you a pride that poisons the very elevation it is trying to celebrate. The fear that rises in people when a chosen one emerges is not primarily about you. It is about what you represent. It is about the dismantling of a worldview that was built on the assumption that certain people have ceilings and certain people do not, that where you start determines where you finish, that the evidence of your early seasons is a reliable predictor of your eventual outcome. Your emergence does not just change your circumstances. It challenges the entire framework by which the people around you have been making sense of the world. And that kind of challenge, even when it is good news for everyone involved, is experienced by some people as deeply destabilizing. Gideon's enemies did not simply lose a battle. They lost a narrative. They had built their understanding of the power dynamics in that region on an assumption that the people of Israel were too broken, too scattered, too demoralized to mount any meaningful resistance to their oppression. And then 300 men with torches appeared in the darkness, and everything they had built their confidence on collapsed in a single night. The Midianites who survived that encounter did not just retreat to regroup and try again. They fled. The Book of Judges records that they ran as far as Beit Shittah toward Zererah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabbath, which is to say they ran a very long way from a very small number of people holding very simple instruments, because what they encountered was not merely a military engagement. It was a confrontation with a reality that their existing framework had no category for, and the only available response was flight. The people who have underestimated you are going to encounter the same kind of category failure when the fullness of what God has been building in you becomes visible. They are not going to have a box to put it in. They are not going to have a prior model that adequately explains what they are witnessing. And in the absence of a natural explanation, some of them are going to do what the Midianites did. They are going to distance themselves from the discomfort of being confronted by a reality that contradicts everything they concluded about you. And others, the ones whose hearts are more open, The ones whose response to being wrong is curiosity rather than defensiveness, are going to draw closer, are going to want to understand what happened, are going to find themselves strangely moved by the story of a person who endured what you endured and arrived where you are arriving. And those people are going to become part of the next chapter of your story in ways that neither of you can fully anticipate right now. 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 40 says, "You armed me with strength for battle. You humbled my adversaries before me." That verse was written by a man who knew what it felt like to be hunted, to be dismissed, to have his potential denied by the very people who should have celebrated it, and who also knew what it felt like to stand on the other side of all of that and look back at the distance, traveled with the clarity that only a rival can provide. The strength he was celebrating was not something he had manufactured through discipline or developed through training alone. It was something he had been armed with, something given to him for the specific purpose of the battles that his calling required him to fight. And the humbling of his adversaries was not something he had engineered through strategy or revenge. It was something that happened as a natural consequence of a life that had been genuinely aligned with a divine purpose too large for opposition to permanently contain. You are being armed right now, not with weapons that the natural eye can see, but with the kind of strength that only forms in a person who has been through the fire and refused to let it define them as burned rather than refined. Every season of resistance you have navigated has been adding to that armament. Every moment of choosing faith over fear, choosing forward over backward, choosing to hold the dream alive in a season that gave it no visible support, has been contributing to a strength that is now, in this season, reaching a level of completion that is about to express itself in ways that will leave the watching world without adequate words. Right now, if something in you is rising as you receive these words, if the part of you that has been waiting for permission to believe again is standing up and recognizing itself in everything that has been spoken over this message, then I want you to do one thing. Type the words "they were wrong" in the comments right now. Not as bitterness, not as retaliation against anyone who hurt you, but as a declaration of spiritual clarity, as the moment you formally release the false verdict that was spoken over your life by people who did not have the authority to deliver it, as the moment you look at every conclusion that was drawn about your ceiling and your limitations and your potential and you say, with the full weight of everything you have walked through, they were wrong. They were wrong about what you were capable of. They were wrong about where your story was going. They were wrong about what was living inside you. And the evidence of how wrong they were is still being written, is still accumulating, is still building toward a revelation so complete that the words they spoke over you will not even be recognizable in the light of where you are going. The terror in the eyes of the ones who underestimated you is already beginning. You may not be able to see it yet in the natural, but in the spirit it is already present, already real. Already the opening movement of a vindication so complete and so public that no one who witnessed your struggle will be able to pretend they did not also witness your breakthrough. What God does for his chosen ones, he does thoroughly. He does not do partial vindications. He does not restore a portion of what was taken and leave the rest as a lesson in managing expectations. He restores with interest, with overflow, with a completeness that makes the before and the after of a chosen one's story look like two entirely different lives, because in the most important sense, they are. The person who emerges from genuine preparation in the hands of God is not the same person who entered the preparation season, and the life that awaits on the other side of this threshold is not the same life that was available before the preparation was complete. You are not going back to what was. You are moving forward into what has always been intended. And what has always been intended for you is something that your former self, the one who sat in the silence and wondered if heaven had moved on, would not have had the capacity to receive. But this version of you, the one that the preparation built, the one that the fire refined, the one that the silence formed, this version is ready, and heaven knows it. There is a word that heaven has been holding in reserve for this season of your life, and it is the word that every chosen one who has walked the long road of preparation has been moving toward without always knowing that is where they were headed. That word is restoration, not partial restoration, not the kind of recovery that gets you back to the baseline you started from before everything was taken, not the version of restoration that simply returns what was lost and calls it even. The kind of restoration that the God of chosen ones specializes in is the kind that makes the after so disproportionate to the before that the only honest way to describe the distance between them is miracle. It is the kind that adds interest to every year of waiting, that multiplies what was stolen by a factor that human accounting has no adequate category for, that takes the very areas where the enemy concentrated his most sustained assault and turns them into the precise locations of the most dramatic and most visible overflow. Gideon did not finish his story in the winepress. He did not finish it hiding. He did not finish it as the least member of the weakest clan in Manasseh, defined forever by the smallness of his beginning and the modesty of his origins. He finished it as a deliverer, as a leader, as the man whose name is recorded in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews in the company of the great men and women of faith, listed among those whose lives demonstrated what becomes possible when a chosen one stops arguing with their calling and starts walking toward it. The distance between the man hiding in the winepress and the man listed in the hall of faith is not a distance that human effort alone could account for. It is a distance that only divine accompaniment can explain, only the presence of a God who sees what no one else sees and calls it forward into visibility, with an authority that no opposition can permanently resist. That same distance is the distance your story is traveling right now. The gap between where you have been and where you are going is not a gap that your talent alone will bridge, not a gap that your strategy alone will close, not a gap that your connections or your resources or your education or your background will be sufficient to account for. It is a gap that only divine accompaniment can explain, and the presence that has been with you through every silent season, through every season of hiding, through every moment of wondering whether the calling was real and the promise was genuine and the preparation was leading anywhere worth going, that presence has not diminished. It has not grown impatient. It has not revised its assessment of what your life is capable of becoming. It has been constant, faithful, unwavering, as committed to the completion of what it started in you on the day it first pressed its intention into the fabric of your being, as it was in the very first moment of your calling. The book of Joel chapter 2, verse 25 says, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten." Read that promise slowly and let it land in the specific places of your own story where the locusts have been most active. The years that felt consumed by waiting. The seasons that felt stripped of everything that should have been growing. The chapters where the harvest that should have been accumulating was being taken before it could be gathered, where the investment of time and faith and obedience seemed to be, producing nothing visible, where the ground of your life looked barren in a way that made it difficult to believe that anything would ever grow there again. God is not looking at those years as losses to be mourned and moved on from. He is looking at them as a debt that is owed to you, a debt he has both the intention and the ability to repay, with a thoroughness and a generosity that will make the years of the locust look like the setup for the most extraordinary display of divine faithfulness your life has ever contained. Restoration of this kind does not arrive quietly. It does not slip in through the back door and take up residence without anyone noticing. When God restores a chosen one who has been genuinely prepared through the fire and the silence and the long road of faithful waiting, the restoration tends to arrive in a way that is impossible to overlook, impossible to minimize. impossible to attribute to luck or timing or the natural fluctuations of circumstance. It arrives with the fingerprints of heaven all over it, with a completeness and a specificity that speaks directly to the exact nature of what was taken, that addresses not just the practical dimensions of what was lost, but the emotional and spiritual dimensions as well. That heals not just the circumstances, but the places in the heart that the circumstances damaged on their way through. The people who watched you lose are about to watch you receive. And the watching is going to require something of them that observation of ordinary success never requires, because ordinary success can always be explained, can always be traced back to a combination of factors that add up to a predictable outcome, can always be accommodated within an existing framework for understanding how the world works. What is coming for you does not fit into that framework. What is coming for you belongs to a different category entirely, the category of things that happen when a chosen one who has been genuinely prepared by God finally steps into the fullness of what was always intended for their life, and that category has only one adequate label. It is called grace, and it moves with a speed and a completeness and a disregard for natural limitation that leaves everyone who witnesses it, including the one receiving it, standing in a kind of breathless, grateful, overwhelmed astonishment at the faithfulness of a God who does not forget what he started and does not abandon what he chose. You have sown in tears. That is not a metaphor for mild disappointment. That is the language of genuine grief, of real loss, of seasons where the weight of what you were carrying broke something in you that you were not sure would ever be repaired. You have sown in tears, and the promise that attaches to that kind of sowing is not a modest one. It is the promise of coming home with songs, of returning with joy, of arriving at a harvest so abundant that it takes both arms to carry it and still overflows. That harvest is not a distant possibility contingent on circumstances aligning in your favor. It is a certainty rooted in the character of a God who keeps his word, who honors the investment of a life that trusted him in the dark, who has been watching every tear sown into the ground of your story and has been holding the corresponding harvest in reserve for the exact season when you are positioned to receive it. The ones who underestimated you made their assessment before the harvest. They looked at the field in the sowing season, when the ground was broken and the seeds were in the earth and nothing was visible above the surface, and they concluded that the field was empty. They did not understand that the most important agricultural activity is the invisible kind, the kind that happens in the dark under the surface where no casual observer can see it, the kind that looks from the outside like nothing and is from the inside the entire story. They made their conclusion too early. They called the outcome before the season was complete. And the season is now completing in a way that is going to require them to revise every conclusion they drew, to walk back every assessment they made, to stand in the presence of a harvest they did not believe was coming and reckon with the fact that the ground they wrote off was never empty. It was always full of exactly what it needed to be full of. It was simply not yet time for it to show. It is almost time for it to show. The ground of your life, the long-prepared, deeply worked, faithfully tended ground of a chosen one who refused to stop believing in the promise, even when the promise gave no visible evidence of its progress, is about to produce something that silences every voice that ever spoke a word of limitation over your future. And when it does, when the harvest finally breaks through the surface in a way that cannot be missed and cannot be denied, the most important thing you will know is not that you were right and they were wrong. The most important thing you will know is that you were never alone. That through every season of the sowing, through every year that felt consumed and every chapter that felt stripped, through every silent night and every morning where you had to choose faith before you felt it, you were accompanied. And the one who accompanied you is the same one who is about to make your table overflow in the presence of the very ones who once looked at your empty field and walked away. You have traveled a long road to arrive at this moment. Not just the road of this message, though this message has covered ground that matters, has spoken into places that needed to be spoken into, has called forward things in you that have been waiting for exactly this kind of summons. The longer road, the one that began before you ever found this channel, before you ever pressed play on this video, before you ever suspected that a message like this one existed and was aimed precisely at the place in you that needed it most. That road has been the real journey, and everything that happened on it, every detour, every valley, every season of silence, and every moment of wondering whether you were still on the right path, has been contributing to the person who is sitting here right now, receiving these final words with a heart that is more open and more ready than it has been in a very long time. You came into this message carrying something. Most people do. They carry the weight of years that did not go the way they planned, the residue of words spoken over them by people who did not understand their assignment, the quiet erosion of hope that happens when you hold a promise through season after season without visible evidence that the promise is still active. You came in carrying the accumulated evidence of a world that assessed you by your surface and missed your depth, that measured you by your beginnings and drew conclusions about your ending, that watched you navigate the winepress seasons of your life and decided that the winepress was your permanent address. And somewhere in the course of what has been spoken over you today, something began to shift. Something that had been held down by the weight of all of that began to rise. Something in you that had learned to stay quiet in order to avoid the pain of hope deferred began to speak again, began to say yes again, began to recognize itself in the story of a man called Mighty Warrior while hiding in fear, and to draw from that recognition a courage it had almost forgotten it possessed. That courage is real. The recognition was not wishful thinking. The stirring in your spirit as these words have unfolded has not been an emotional response to well-crafted sentences. It has been the response of something genuine in you to something genuine being spoken over you, the response of a calling recognizing its name being called, the response of a fire that has been burning in the hidden place finally, hearing permission to show itself to the world that needs its light. And as we come to the close of this message, I want to do something that feels as natural as breathing at a moment like this, because there are no adequate human words for what needs to be expressed at the end of a journey like the one we have taken together today. And the most honest thing I can offer you in this closing space is not another declaration or another prophetic word, but a prayer spoken over you and for you and with you, because you deserve to be prayed for, and because the God who has been the subject of everything spoken in this message is the same God who is listening right now. So if you are willing, wherever you are, whatever position you are in, whether you are driving or sitting or lying down or standing in a room full of people who have no idea what is happening in your spirit right now, I invite you to receive these words as a prayer spoken directly over your life. Father, you see this one. You have always seen this one. Before the world formed an opinion about them, before the seasons of difficulty had a chance to write a narrative over their life, before any voice of limitation or doubt or dismissal had a chance to plant itself in the soil of who they are, you saw them. You knew them. You chose them. And everything that has happened since that choosing, every road traveled and every valley crossed and every silent season endured, has been held in your hands with a care and a precision and a faithfulness that this person has not always been able to feel, but that has been real every single moment regardless of what they felt. Today, in this moment, I ask that you make it real to them in a way that goes beyond feeling, that settles into the deep place where the most durable knowing lives, that roots itself in their identity with a permanence that no future season of difficulty will be able to dislodge. Restore to them what was taken, Not just the practical things, the opportunities missed and the time elapsed and the resources consumed, but the internal things, the confidence that got eroded, the hope that got deferred, the sense of divine accompaniment that got obscured by the length and the difficulty of the road. Restore their joy. Restore their expectation. Restore their ability to hold a promise with open hands and trust the one who made it to bring it to pass in the right season and in the right way. Let the harvest that is coming be so complete and so disproportionate to the loss they experience that every person who witnessed their struggle will be left without a natural explanation for what they are witnessing. Let the vindication be public enough to be undeniable and gentle enough to be received with gratitude, rather than pride. Let what comes next in their story be so clearly the work of your hand that the only response available to anyone watching is awe. And let this one, this chosen called prepared, fire-carrying, torch-holding, winepress surviving, silence enduring, underestimated and about to be revealed one, let them know, in a way they will not be able to talk themselves out of tomorrow morning, that they were never alone, not for a single day, not for a single hour, not in the darkest night or the longest silence or the season that felt the most forsaken. You were there, you are here, and you are not finished. Amen. That prayer was not a formality. It was a transaction, and the one on the other side of it is faithful to complete what he begins. You leave this message different from how you arrived, not because of the eloquence of anything spoken here, but because truth, when it finds the place it was aimed at, always produces a change that persists beyond the moment of its delivery. The Gideon who walked away from his encounter with the angel was not the same man who had been thrashing wheat in fear. The encounter changed his self-understanding, and changed self-understanding is the beginning of changed circumstances, because you cannot consistently act at a level higher than the level at which you understand yourself, and you have just received an understanding of yourself that is more accurate than anything fear or disappointment or the opinions of limited people ever produced. So carry this forward, not just as a memory of a message that moved you, but as a living reality that shapes the choices you make tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Choose the thing aligned with your calling. Hold the torch even in the darkness. Break the jar when the moment requires it. Trust the silence as formation rather than abandonment. And when the harvest comes, and it is coming, receive it with the gratitude of someone who knows exactly what it cost and exactly who made it possible. If this message has been something real to you, if it has touched the place it was aiming for, share it with someone who needs to hear that they were chosen before they were challenged. Like this video, as an act of agreement with everything that has been spoken over you today. Subscribe to this channel if you want to stay connected to a community of chosen ones who are choosing, day by day and step by step, to walk in the fullness of everything they were made to be. And if you feel led to support this work financially so that more messages like this one can reach more people who are sitting in their own winepress wondering if heaven has forgotten them, the donate link is in the video description and in the pinned comment below. Every contribution extends the light. Every share carries the fire to someone who needs it. Every subscriber joins a company of people who have decided that the winepress is not their permanent address, and the silence was not their final answer. You are chosen, you are called, you are carried, and you are closer to the moment of your revealing than anything in your current circumstances would suggest. Go forward in that knowing. The world is waiting for the light you carry, and it has waited long enough.